The skillet was too heavy for her. Lynn gripped the cast iron handle with both hands, her knuckles white, feeling the dense, familiar weight that had been her mother's anchor for 10 years. It was still warm from the morning's bacon, and the faint scent of wood smoke and rendered fat clung to it like a memory. Outside the open door of the cook house, the Wyoming sun was already baking the dust of the ranch yard into a fine, pale powder. A dozen men were coming for their midday meal, men with appetites carved from long hours in the saddle, and all she had to offer them was the skillet, a sack of flour, and a fear so sharp it felt like a shard of glass in her throat. Her name was Lynn, and she was 18 years old. Her mother, lay on a narrow cot in their small cabin behind the cook house, her breath a shallow, rattling thing. The fever had taken her 2 days ago, swift and brutal, stealing the strength from her limbs and the light from her eyes. This job, cooking for the hands at the Circle V ranch, was all they had. It provided their small cabin, their food, and the few dollars a month that kept them from utter destitution. Without it, they would be cast out, 2 Chinese women with nowhere to go in a territory that saw them as little more than ghosts. The ranch foreman, Mr. Henderson, a man whose face was a road map of sun squints and disapproval, had been blunt. "Your mother's a good cook, girl. You are not your mother. I'm paying for a cook, not a charity case. I'll give you till noon. If those men complain, you're both out." He had said it that morning, his words as hard and dry as the baked earth. Now, noon was approaching. She could hear the jingle of spurs and the low murmur of male voices as the hands began to gather at the long trestle tables under the shade of a cottonwood. She had spent the morning in a panic, making what she knew best, a thick beef stew, sourdough biscuits, and a pot of strong coffee. But her hands shook as she worked, and every sound from the yard made her flinch. She was just a girl, a daughter who had only ever helped. Now she had to fill the space left by a woman everyone had respected for her quiet efficiency and the simple, hearty meals that fueled their hard lives. The stew smelled right, the biscuits had risen, but the skillet in her hands felt like an accusation. It felt like failure. Henderson's shadow fell across the doorway. He didn't enter, just stood there, blocking the light. "They're waiting." Lynn's heart hammered against her ribs. She couldn't speak, could only nod. She reached for the stack of tin plates, her movements clumsy. "Give her a minute, Henderson," a low voice said from behind the foreman. Lynn looked up. A man stepped around Henderson, moving with a quiet economy that made the foreman seem loud and restless by comparison. He was tall and lean, his face weathered by the sun and wind to the color of old leather. His eyes, a pale, startling blue, were fixed on her. She had seen him before, of course. Arthur Vance. He was one of the senior hands, a man who rarely spoke in the boisterous way the others did. He moved his horse with a gentle hand and kept to himself, yet the other men seemed to grant him an unspoken authority. Henderson grunted. "We ain't got a minute, Vance. We got a dozen hungry men and a girl playing with pots." Arthur didn't look at the foreman. His gaze remained on Lynn, on her trembling hands and the wide, frightened look in her eyes. He saw the skillet on the stove, the neat stacks of biscuits on the cooling rack, the steam rising from the large stew pot. He took in the entire scene with a single, sweeping glance. "One meal," he said, his voice calm and even. "That's all it takes to know if a cook has the touch. Let her serve one meal. And if it's slop?" Henderson challenged. "Then I'll ride out and find us a new cook tomorrow," Arthur said. "I'll cover the lost day's wages myself." The offer hung in the hot, still air. It was an extraordinary gesture. A cowboy's wages were hard-earned and precious. For him to risk a day's pay on a stranger, on her, was unthinkable. Henderson stared at Arthur, then at Lynn, his expression a mixture of annoyance and grudging respect for his best hand. He finally gave a sharp, reluctant nod. "Fine. One meal. But I hear one word of complaint, she's gone before sunset." He turned and stalked away, leaving Lynn alone in the doorway with Arthur Vance. The cowboy looked at her for a long moment. He didn't smile, but the harshness in his eyes softened almost imperceptibly. "They're hungry," he said, as if it were the only piece of advice she needed. Then he too turned and walked toward the tables, leaving Lin with the heavy skillet, a pot of stew, and the one chance a lonely cowboy had just bought for her. She did not yet know that the meal she was about to serve was not the only thing being judged. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Lin moved. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but Arthur's quiet confidence had banked it, like a layer of ash over hot coals. She carried the heavy stew pot to the serving window, her arms straining. One of the younger hands, a boy barely older than herself, whistled low. "Look what we got here. Hope you can cook better than you look, Missy." A few of the men chuckled. Lin's face burned, but she kept her eyes down, focusing on the ladle in her hand. She began to serve, spooning the thick, fragrant stew onto each tin plate that was shoved through the window. Then came the biscuits, golden brown and fluffy. She worked in a silence broken only by the scrape of tin on wood and the grunts of the men. A tall, wiry man with a mean-looking scar bisecting his eyebrow snatched his plate. His name was Brody. He was known for his foul temper and his cruelty to horses. He sneered at her through the window. "My ma's dog eats better than this." Lin flinched, but said nothing. She watched as the men carried their plates to the tables. They sat down, a jury of hungry, skeptical cowboys. For a moment, there was only the sound of spoons clattering against tin. She held her breath, waiting for the verdict. She expected grumbling, complaints, maybe even plates shoved back through the window. But the complaints never came. Instead, a different kind of sound began to fill the air. The deliberate, rhythmic sound of men eating. Seriously eating. Someone let out a low groan of satisfaction. Another man spoke, his mouth full. "Henderson, this ain't half bad." "Bad," another voice chimed in. "This is the best stew I've had since I left Missouri." Lin risked a glance out the window. Brody was scowling, but he was eating, shoveling the stew into his mouth as fast as anyone else. Henderson was eating too, his expression unreadable, but he had already taken a second biscuit. Her gaze found Arthur. He was sitting at the end of a bench, slightly apart from the others. He ate slowly, deliberately. He caught her watching, and for a fleeting second, his eyes met hers. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Something loosened in her chest. It wasn't triumph, not yet. It was the fragile beginning of hope. She had passed the first test. She turned back to the kitchen, her hands feeling a little steadier. She had earned herself the afternoon. But the reprieve was short-lived. Over the next few days, Lin fell into a grueling rhythm. She rose before dawn to stoke the fire and start the coffee, worked all day to prepare 3 meals for the ravenous crew, and spent her evenings by her mother's bedside, spooning broth between her parched lips and wiping her brow with cool cloths. The work was relentless, and the loneliness was a constant ache. The men, for the most part, left her alone. They ate her food, which was consistently better than any of them had a right to expect, and offered gruff, monosyllabic thanks. But she was still an outsider, a silent figure in the background of their lives. All except for Brody. He seemed to take her quiet success as a personal insult. He made it his mission to torment her in small, insidious ways. He would kick over her bucket of wash water as if by accident. He would complain loudly that the coffee was weak, even as others were asking for a third cup. One afternoon, as she was kneading dough for the evening's bread, he swaggered into the cookhouse, ostensibly to refill his canteen. He leaned against the counter, watching her with his cold, flat eyes. "Working hard," he said. "It wasn't a question. Too hard for a little thing like you. You'll wear yourself out." Lin kept her focus on the dough, pushing and folding with practiced motions. "The work must be done." "Or what?" "They'll send you packing." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Don't you worry. A pretty little thing like you could find other work. Easier work." The implication was ugly and clear. A hot wave of shame and anger washed over her. Her hand stilled on the dough. Before she could think of a reply, a shadow filled the doorway again. Brody, Arthur Vance said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the thick, humid air like a cold blade. Henderson's looking for you. Said something about a fence down in the south pasture. Brody straightened up, his sneer faltering as he met Arthur's level gaze. There was no threat in Arthur's posture, no overt aggression, but a palpable sense of danger emanated from him. Brody held his stare for a moment, then his eyes flickered away. He grumbled something under his breath and pushed himself off the counter, grabbing his canteen and stalking out of the cookhouse without another word. The silence he left behind was heavy. Lynn stared down at the dough, her knuckles white. He won't bother you again, Arthur said from the doorway. She looked up. Thank you. Her voice was barely a whisper. He gave that same short, dismissive nod he always did, as if deflecting her gratitude. He started to turn away, then paused. Your mother? He asked, his voice softer now. How is she? The same, Lynn said, and the fragile composure she had maintained for days finally cracked. Her eyes filled with tears. The fever won't break. He stepped fully into the cookhouse, his presence seeming to shrink the small space. He looked around, at the clean counters, the neatly stacked firewood, the small pot of herbs growing on the windowsill. He looked at her, at the flour dusting her cheek and the exhaustion etched around her eyes. He didn't offer words of comfort. He didn't say it will be all right. Instead, he walked over to the 2 heavy buckets of water she had hauled from the well that morning. He picked them both up as if they were empty. I'll fetch you fresh water for the evening, he said. It wasn't an offer. It was a statement. And with that, he was gone, leaving her alone in the quiet kitchen. Lynn watched him go, a single tear tracing a path through the flour on her cheek. It was the first act of simple, unasked-for kindness she had received since her mother had fallen ill, and it meant more than he could ever know. But as she watched him cross the yard, she saw Brody watching him too, his face dark with resentment. Arthur's protection had a cost, and she had a sinking feeling that Brody would find a way to make them both pay. A week later, her mother's fever broke. The crisis had passed, but Anne was left frail and weak, unable to resume her duties. Henderson grudgingly allowed Lynn to stay on as cook, a decision based purely on the quality of her biscuits and the fact that the men had stopped complaining. Life settled into a new, fragile routine. Lynn cooked, and in the quiet hours of the late afternoon, she would help her mother sit outside their cabin, letting the warm sun touch her face. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Arthur approached. He didn't ride up with the clatter and dust of the other men. He walked, leading his horse, and stopped a respectful distance from their cabin. He held a small, cloth-wrapped bundle in his hand. Evening, he said, his eyes on Anne for a moment before shifting to Lynn. Mr. Vance, Lynn replied, rising from her stool. This is for your mother, he said, holding out the bundle. The doc in town said it might help with the cough. Lynn took the package. Inside was a small bottle of dark liquid, a patent medicine, and a jar of honey. Such things were expensive, a luxury they could never afford. She looked from the bottle to his face, stunned. I cannot pay you for this. It's not a loan, he said gruffly, looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. He gestured toward the small patch of earth beside the cabin where a few hardy herbs struggled in the dry soil. Your mother's garden. Those plants. They look thirsty. It was a clumsy change of subject, but Lynn understood. He didn't want thanks. He wanted to talk about something simple, something real. I try to water them, she said. But I don't know all their names. My mother. I know, he said softly. He walked over to the patch and crouched down, touching a leaf with a surprisingly gentle finger. My mother had a garden. Grew mostly vegetables. Always said you could tell a lot about a person by what they chose to grow. This glimpse into his past was so unexpected it left Lynn speechless. She had never imagined Arthur Vance with a mother, a garden, a life before this dusty ranch. He was a fixed point in her world, as silent and enduring as the mountains on the horizon. She taught me to cook, Lynn found herself saying, the words coming out in a rush. She had a book, With all her recipes, she didn't know why she was telling him this, but his quiet presence seemed to pull the words from her. She hurried inside and returned with the small, all-cloth-covered book. The pages were soft and worn, filled with columns of elegant Chinese characters. Beside each entry, her mother had drawn a small, careful picture of the dish or the specific herb required. She opened it and showed him a page. He took the book from her, his large, calloused hands holding it with a reverence that touched her deeply. He couldn't read a single word, but he studied the drawings, his brow furrowed in concentration. He pointed to a drawing of a star-shaped spice. "What is this one?" "Anise," she said. "It is good for stews. It makes the meat tender." He nodded, tracing the drawing with his fingertip. She was a smart woman. To draw the pictures, he handed the book back to her, his fingers brushing against hers. A jolt, small and warm, passed between them. He pulled his hand back quickly, as if burned. A faint flush rose on his neck. The quiet moment was shattered by Henderson's voice bellowing across the yard. "Vance! We've got strays in the North Canyon." Arthur straightened, his brief moment of softness vanishing as the demands of his world reasserted themselves. He gave Lynn a final, quick nod and was gone, striding toward the corral. Lynn stood watching him, the little recipe book clutched in her hands. She now knew two things about Arthur Vance: he had lost his own mother, and his hands, for all their roughness, knew how to be gentle. This newfound connection, however fragile, did not go unnoticed. Brody saw every quiet conversation, every time Arthur stopped by the cookhouse for an extra cup of coffee. His resentment festered, turning into a dangerous poison. He couldn't get Lynn fired for her cooking, so he decided to attack the one thing she had left, her honor. The rumors started subtly. A missing sack of flour. A tin of peaches that had vanished from the storeroom. Brody would mention it casually at the dinner table, just loud enough for everyone to hear. Funny how supplies have been walking off since the new cook took over. The men, who had grown to like Lynn's cooking, mostly ignored him. But the seed of suspicion, once planted, began to grow. Henderson, ever mindful of the ranch's bottom line, grew watchful. He started checking the inventory himself every evening. Lynn felt the shift. The easy atmosphere in the cookhouse grew tense. The men's eyes followed her. She was once again the outsider, the untrustworthy stranger. The situation came to a head when a whole side of bacon disappeared from the smokehouse. It was a significant loss. Henderson stormed into the cookhouse, his face thunderous. "All right, girl, this has gone on long enough," he snarled. "Flour and peaches are one thing, but this is theft. Pack your things. Both of you." "I took nothing," Lynn said, her voice shaking but firm. She stood her ground, her small frame rigid with defiance. "And I'm supposed to believe that?" Henderson scoffed. "Who else would it be?" "Perhaps the person who keeps track of what goes missing," a quiet voice said. Arthur stood in the doorway, his expression grim. He walked past Henderson and stopped in front of Lynn. "Did you take it?" he asked her directly, his blue eyes searching hers. "No," she whispered, her heart breaking that he even had to ask. He nodded once, satisfied. He turned back to Henderson. "Then someone else did. I've seen Brody snooping around the storeroom after dark. I think you should search his things before you throw an innocent woman out." "Search my things?" Brody had appeared behind Arthur, his face a mask of outrage. "On the word of this liar? And him, her pet cowboy." The accusation was vile, and the other hands, who had gathered to watch the confrontation, shifted uncomfortably. Henderson was caught. Accusing one of his own men was a serious matter. But so was losing supplies. It was Lynn who broke the stalemate. She lifted her chin, her fear transmuting into a cold, hard resolve. "Search my cabin," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Search everything we own. If you find anything that is not ours, I will not only leave, I will work until the debt is paid. But if you find nothing, you must search his." It was an incredible gamble. She was wagering her freedom and her reputation against the foreman's sense of fairness. Henderson stared at her, then at Brodie's sneering face, and finally at Arthur's unyielding expression. "Fine," he bit out. "Fine. We'll do it your way." The search of Lynn's small cabin was a swift and humiliating affair. Two of the men rummaged through their few belongings, tipping over their meager possessions while Lynn and her mother stood outside, watching in shamed silence. They found nothing. Not a single misplaced bean. Then, Henderson, with Arthur and two other men at his side, strode to the bunkhouse. Brodie followed, protesting loudly, his bravado beginning to fray at the edges. A few minutes later, Henderson emerged. In his hand, he held a half-empty tin of peaches and a small sack of flour, pulled from the bottom of Brodie's bedroll. Tucked beneath the mattress, they found the missing side of bacon, wrapped in oilcloth. Brodie's face went pale. The game was over? "Get your pay and get off my land," Henderson said, his voice low and full of contempt. "Now." Brodie shot a look of pure hatred at Lynn, a venomous promise of retribution. Then he turned and stormed off to collect his horse, his time at the Circle V finished. The immediate crisis was over. Lynn had been vindicated. But as she watched Brodie ride out, a small speck of dust against the setting sun, a cold dread settled in her stomach. The look in his eyes had not been one of defeat. It had been a promise. 3 months passed. The blistering heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden days of early autumn. The aspens in the high country turned a brilliant yellow, and the air held the clean, sharp scent of coming frost. Lynn was no longer the temporary cook. She was simply the cook. The men, shamed by their suspicion and impressed by her quiet courage, had come to regard her with a fierce, protective loyalty. They saved her the best cuts of meat, kept her woodpile high, and their conversations at the trestle tables were now peppered with respectful greetings of "Morning, Lynn," and "Thanks for the supper, Lynn." Her mother, was much improved. She would likely never regain her full strength, but she could now spend her days sitting in a chair beside the cookhouse door, helping Lynn with small tasks and offering quiet advice. Her presence was a steadying comfort, a visible sign that their small, fragile world had stabilized. And then there was Arthur. Their connection had deepened in the quiet, unspoken way of the frontier. He had fallen into a habit of stopping by the cookhouse each morning before his ride, a tin cup of coffee in his hand, to talk for a few minutes while she prepared the day's first meal. They rarely spoke of anything important. He would mention the weather, the state of the herd, or a lame horse. She would tell him about her mother's progress or a new recipe she was trying. But beneath the simple words, a current of understanding flowed between them, a recognition of a shared solitude. He had started to learn the names of the herbs in her garden, his rough voice stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds, and the sight of his large frame crouched over the small plants never failed to bring a faint smile to her lips. One evening, he returned from a 2-day trip to town for supplies. He walked to the cookhouse, not the bunkhouse, and set a heavy object on her work table. It was a brand new cast iron pot, black and smooth and perfect. Lynn stared at it, then up at him. The old one was cracked, he said by way of explanation, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder. "Figured you could use it." She reached out and touched the pot's surface. It was cool and solid beneath her fingertips. It was a simple, practical gift, but it was also a statement. The old, cracked pot represented a life of making do, of uncertainty. This new one spoke of permanence, of a future. It was the most romantic gesture she had ever known. "Thank you, Arthur," she said softly. He finally met her eyes. The setting sun, slanting through the cookhouse window, illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air and caught the deep blue of his gaze. He saw the genuine gratitude in her face, and for the first time since she had met him, a real, unguarded smile touched his lips. It transformed his weathered face, erasing years of hardship and loneliness. "You're welcome, Lynn," he said. He stood there for a moment longer, the silence between them comfortable and full of unspoken things. In the vast, hard country of the West, a place that demanded so much and offered so little in return, they had found something rare. It wasn't built on grand declarations or passionate promises. It was built on the steady, quiet rhythm of shared work, of mutual respect, and the simple, profound comfort of a pot of good stew. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.